man in the snow did not reach for a pistol. He reached for a knife. In the darkness, that should have meant almost nothing. A knife was a tool, a survival weapon, something a Soviet scout might carry through forests, across frozen ground, or behind enemy lines. But this knife was different. Its blade was only half the secret. Hidden inside the handle was a single-shot firearm built around a specialized cartridge designed to kill without the spectacular report of an ordinary gunshot. There was no conventional pistol grip, no magazine, no obvious barrel, no familiar weapon profile that an enemy sentry might recognize from a distance. The weapon looked like a knife because it was a knife, but if the situation became desperate enough, the same object could become something else entirely. That strange contradiction was exactly the point. The Soviet Union had spent decades developing weapons for soldiers who might have to operate alone, far from artillery, far from resupply, and sometimes far from anyone who could rescue them. For such a soldier, a knife was already essential. A firearm was essential too. Carrying both created another problem: weight, bulk, visibility, and one more piece of equipment that could be lost. The solution was not to make a better pistol, it was to hide a pistol inside something the soldier already carried. The result was the NRS-2, the Soviet special scout knife that concealed a one-shot firearm in its handle. But the strangest part of the story is not that the Soviets built a knife that could fire a bullet. The strange part is why they believed such an awkward weapon was worth building at all. Because the NRS-2 was never intended to replace a rifle. It was never supposed to become the standard sidearm of an army. It existed for the moment when everything else had gone wrong. And to understand that moment, we have to enter the world that created it. The Soviet Special Operations soldier lived under a very different set of assumptions from the ordinary infantryman. His mission might begin with a parachute drop, a helicopter insertion, a covert crossing, a reconnaissance patrol, or an operation deep behind an enemy line. He might carry equipment selected not for comfort, but for the possibility that he would have to survive without support. In that world, every object had to justify its weight. A knife could cut rope, it could prepare food, it could clear obstacles, it could serve as a last resort weapon. Its sheath could carry additional functions. A normal pistol, by contrast, existed almost entirely to shoot. The Soviet designers therefore asked a bizarre question. What if the knife could perform one more job? What if the handle itself could become a firearm? The idea was not born in the 1980s. The NRS-2 was the descendant of an earlier Soviet experiment, known simply as the NRS, a firing reconnaissance knife developed during the Cold War for special-purpose users. The original NRS was associated with the 7.62 x 35 mm SP3 special cartridge, a round created around a radical concept. Instead of allowing hot propellant gases to escape from the weapon and announce the shot with muzzle blast and flash, trap those gases inside the cartridge. The trick involved a captive piston. When the cartridge fired, expanding gas pushed the piston forward, and the piston drove the bullet down the barrel. At the end of its travel, the piston was stopped inside the cartridge case, sealing the propellant gases behind it. The bullet left. The gas did not. That meant the weapon did not need a conventional suppressor hanging from the muzzle. The technology had obvious advantages for clandestine work, but it came with compromises. The ammunition was specialized, the weapon was specialized, and the firing knife itself was a compromise, stacked on top of another compromise. It had only one shot. It was not a normal handgun. It required a small removable barrel assembly to be extracted from the handle for loading. The entire concept depended on the assumption that the user did not need a conventional firearm most of the time. He needed something else first. The knife remained a knife. The gun was an emergency capability concealed within it. Then the Soviet special weapons world changed again. In the early 1980s, Soviet engineers developed the SP4 cartridge for the PSS silent pistol. The PSS represented a more mature approach to the same fundamental problem. How could a weapon fire a useful projectile without producing the signature associated with a conventional firearm? The SP4 used the captive piston principle in a more powerful package. When fired, the internal piston drove a short, cylindrical projectile forward and then stopped inside the cartridge case, retaining the propellant gases. The result was not literally silent. Mechanical sounds still existed, and no gunshot is magically reduced to absolute silence. But the defining muzzle blast and flash of a conventional cartridge were dramatically reduced. The system was designed for a very specific military requirement, and once that cartridge entered Soviet service, an obvious question emerged. If the PSS had moved to SP4, what about the firing knife? The answer became NRS-2. The second-generation knife was not simply a cosmetic redesign. Its firing mechanism had to accommodate the new cartridge and the greater demands placed on the system. Engineers at the Tula arms plant worked on the modernization. Sources identified Genrik Anatolievich Savishchev, Igor Filipovich Shedlos, and Vyacheslav Yakovlevich Ovchinnikov among those involved in the NRS-2 development. Their challenge was deceptively simple to describe and extremely difficult to execute. Take a knife, preserve its practical military functions, fit a firing mechanism into the handle, adapt that mechanism to the SP4 cartridge, and make the whole package reliable enough for a soldier to trust. The blade could not become a fragile decorative accessory. The handle could not become an oversized pistol grip. The weapon had to remain compact enough to function as a knife while concealing a real firing mechanism. The result was accepted for service in 1986, alongside the non-firing NR2 version. On paper, that sounds like the end of the engineering story. In reality, it was where the real story begins, because the NRS-2 was a weapon built around contradiction. The blade had to be strong enough for field use. The handle had to contain a barrel. The barrel had to be short because there was almost no room for anything longer. The firing system had to be simple enough to operate under stress. Yet the whole assembly had to remain compact, balanced, and recognizable as a knife. The engineers were not trying to create the world's best pistol. They were trying to create a pistol that would disappear inside a knife without destroying the knife's usefulness. That distinction explains almost everything about the weapon. The NRS-2's overall length was roughly 290 millimeters, and its firing barrel was only about 60 millimeters long. There was room for one cartridge, one, not 5, not 8, not a magazine hidden beneath the grip. One round. The weapon's very existence admitted a brutal truth. This was not a fighting pistol. It was a contingency weapon. If the user had to fire it, something had already gone badly enough that a single carefully placed shot might be more valuable than carrying nothing at all. The cartridge itself was one of the most remarkable parts of the system. The SP4 was not simply a normal 7.62 millimeter bullet fired through a tiny barrel. It was an integrated silent ammunition system. Its case contained the propellant and a piston. The projectile sat forward of the piston. When the powder burned, pressure moved the piston. The piston pushed the projectile, and then the piston was arrested within the cartridge case. The gases stayed trapped. That meant there was no conventional cloud of escaping propellant gas erupting from the muzzle. No dramatic flash, no familiar crack. The projectile still traveled downrange, but the signature of the shot was fundamentally different. This was an engineering solution to a tactical problem, not a magic trick. The cartridge was specialized because the mission was specialized. It existed because Soviet designers understood that a weapon's sound could be as dangerous as its bullet. A loud shot could reveal a position. A flash could expose a shooter. A conventional suppressor could add length and complexity. The captive piston cartridge moved much of that problem inside the ammunition itself. But that also created another limitation. The ammunition was not ordinary. A soldier could not simply pick up a box of standard rifle cartridges and load them into the knife. The NRS-2 depended on a very particular cartridge designed around a very particular mechanism. Every part of the system was interconnected. The knife needed the ammunition. The ammunition needed the mechanism. The mechanism existed because the mission demanded a discrete shot, and the mission demanded discretion because the user was expected to operate in places where being discovered could mean capture or death. That was the logic of Soviet special-purpose weapon design. It was not always about maximizing firepower. Sometimes it was about minimizing the signature of a single action. The NRS-2 therefore looked almost absurd when viewed through the eyes of conventional infantry doctrine. A soldier armed with an assault rifle would have vastly more firepower. A normal pistol would be easier to reload. A submachine gun would offer greater volume of fire. Even another knife would be simpler. So why carry this thing? Because the NRS-2 was designed for a narrow gap between categories. It was not supposed to replace the rifle. It was not supposed to replace the pistol. It was supposed to exist after the rifle was unavailable, when a conventional pistol was absent, when ammunition was limited, when concealment mattered, or when the user needed a tool that did not look like a firearm. That is where the weapon becomes historically interesting. Its value was not measured by how often it fired. Its value was measured by what happened if the one moment arrived when firing became necessary. To understand the thinking behind it, look at the knife itself. The blade was not an afterthought wrapped around a gun. The NRS-2 was a field knife first in its practical architecture. Its sheath incorporated additional tools, including a wire-cutting function. The design was intended for reconnaissance and field use, where cutting wire and dealing with obstacles could be as important as fighting. The sheath also incorporated features associated with handling detonator components, reflecting the specialized role of the equipment. In other words, the Soviet designer was not asking, how do we hide a pistol inside a knife? The deeper question was, how many problems can one compact object solve for a man operating alone? That is why the NRS-2 is better understood as a survival and special purpose system than as a novelty weapon. The blade was useful. The sheath was useful. The firearm was useful, under specific circumstances. Each part supported the same tactical philosophy: carry one object that can perform several jobs. But the firearm hidden inside the handle created a problem that ordinary knives never had to solve. Where exactly do you put the barrel? The answer was in the rear of the handle. The barrel and chamber assembly could be removed for loading. Once the cartridge was inserted, the assembly returned to the handle and locked into place. The firing mechanism was built into the grip. The muzzle was positioned at the rear of the handle rather than at the end of the blade. This created an unmistakable firing posture. To shoot, the user had to orient the handle toward the target. The knife blade was effectively pointing backward from the firing hand. It was an unnatural configuration because it was never meant to feel like a conventional pistol. The weapon had been built around the assumption that the shooter was using an object whose primary identity was something else. The controls were correspondingly compact. There was a manual safety. There was a cocking mechanism. There was a trigger positioned so the user could fire the weapon once the system was prepared. The sights were minimal. A weapon with a 60mm barrel and a one-shot capacity did not need the elaborate sighting equipment of a rifle. The NRS-2 was intended for short-range use. Sources commonly give an effective range of around 25 meters. That number tells us something important. The weapon was not designed for distant sniping. It was not a miniature sniper rifle. It was a close-range emergency firearm, optimized around concealment and portability rather than reach. And that brings us to the question Soviet engineers could not escape. If the weapon was this specialized, how reliable did it have to be? The answer was extremely reliable, because there was no second shot. A conventional pistol can compensate for a miss with another round. A rifleman can fire a burst. The NRS-2 cannot. Every mechanical component has to do its job, because there is only one opportunity. The barrel has to lock correctly. The cartridge has to chamber correctly. The firing mechanism has to function correctly. The user has to orient the weapon correctly. And after the shot, the spent case has to be removed before the system can be used again. The very feature that makes the knife fascinating also exposes its fundamental weakness. It is a one-shot weapon. That sounds obvious, but it changes the psychology of carrying it. A soldier carrying a normal pistol knows that the weapon remains a continuing source of fire. A soldier carrying the NRS-2 knows that the firearm inside the handle is a single emergency opportunity. If that shot does not solve the problem, the knife immediately becomes a knife again. The Soviet designers had therefore created something that could not be judged by conventional handgun standards. Its success depended on a different metric. Did it provide one discrete shot when the user might otherwise have had none? If the answer was yes, the compromise made sense. If the answer was no, the entire concept collapsed. That is why the SP4 cartridge mattered so much. The cartridge gave the NRS-2 a more capable ammunition system than the earlier NRS had possessed. But it also meant that the firing mechanism had to be redesigned to handle the new round. The engineering team could not simply enlarge a hole and call it an upgrade. The higher performance ammunition placed new demands on the barrel assembly and firing mechanism. The NRS-2's muzzle velocity and ballistic figures are reported differently in different secondary sources, and some published references contain inconsistent dimensions or designations for the SP4 cartridge. The important historical point is not a single disputed number. It is that the SP4 system represented a significant improvement over the earlier SP3 system, and was powerful enough to make the new knife more useful while remaining within the specialized, silent cartridge concept. That improvement had consequences for the blade as well. The NRS-2 received a modified blade intended to improve practical performance. The shape around the point was altered, and the saw section was changed. The goal was not to make the knife more theatrical. It was to make it better at the tasks its users might actually face. That distinction is easy to miss when looking at photographs of the weapon decades later. Modern audiences tend to see the gun first. Soviet engineers saw a field tool with a gun hidden inside it. The weapon's strange appearance is therefore not an accident. It is the visible record of competing requirements forced into one object. The blade says, survival tool. The handle says, firearm. The sheath says, field equipment. The cartridge says, covert operation. Put all four together, and the weapon begins to make sense. But the Soviet Union did not develop the NRS-2 in a vacuum. The Cold War had created a worldwide obsession with special weapons. Both superpowers were interested in firearms that could operate discreetly, weapons that could be concealed, weapons for intelligence personnel, weapons for special forces, and weapons that did not announce their presence with a conventional muzzle blast. The Soviets had their own long tradition of developing unusual weapons for clandestine and special-purpose missions. The NRS-2 belonged to that larger family. It was an answer to a specific problem, not proof that Soviet engineers believed every soldier needed a secret gun knife. That distinction matters because the mythology surrounding unusual weapons often becomes more dramatic than the historical record. There is a temptation to say that Western intelligence agencies were terrified by the NRS-2, that NATO urgently tried to copy it, or that American soldiers were helpless against its hidden firepower. Those claims make a good story, but the evidence does not support treating the NRS-2 as some Cold War superweapon that transformed military doctrine. There is no credible basis for claiming that the United States launched a major program to copy it. There is no evidence that NATO suddenly reorganized around the threat of Soviet gun knives. The reality is more interesting. The NRS-2 was a highly specialized Soviet weapon whose existence demonstrated the lengths to which military engineers would go when ordinary equipment could not meet a very narrow requirement. Its obscurity is part of its significance. Weapons that change wars usually become famous. Weapons that solve tiny problems often disappear into the shadows. The NRS-2 belongs to the second category, and that is exactly where the story turns. Because the question is no longer whether the knife could fire. We know it could. The question is whether firing was ever the primary reason for carrying it. Consider the soldier who receives one. He does not carry it expecting to conduct a firefight with the handle. He carries it because the knife has everyday utility and because, hidden within that utility, is a final option. That makes the weapon psychologically different from a pistol. A pistol announces itself as a weapon. The NRS-2 does not. It can sit on a belt as part of a reconnaissance kit and appear to be exactly what it is, a knife. The hidden firearm becomes important only when the user deliberately converts the object from one role to another. That conversion is the heart of the design. A knife becomes a gun without ceasing to be a knife. The transformation is almost theatrical, but the engineering behind it is brutally practical. The barrel is removed, the cartridge is loaded, the barrel assembly is secured, the firing mechanism is prepared. The handle becomes the firing unit. The user aims using crude sights. One shot is available. Afterward, the spent case has to be extracted and the system reloaded if circumstances permit. There is nothing automatic about it. No magazine, no slide cycling, no burst, no second chance built into the mechanism. The weapon's simplicity is therefore deceptive. It is mechanically compact, but operationally unforgiving. And the most remarkable component may be the ammunition itself. The SP4's captive piston solves a problem that conventional suppressors attack from the outside. A suppressor attempts to slow and cool escaping gas after the cartridge fires. The SP4 instead keeps the propellant gases inside the cartridge. That is why the system can remain compact. The barrel does not need to carry a large suppressor tube. The handle does not need to accommodate a conventional pistol mechanism. The ammunition performs part of the suppression job before the gases ever reach the muzzle. In engineering terms, it moves the problem from the weapon into the cartridge. That is elegant. But elegance has a price. Special ammunition is expensive and complicated. The cartridge must be manufactured to precise tolerances. The piston must move correctly. It must seal correctly. The projectile must leave the case without destroying the pressure relationship. And the spent case is not an ordinary empty casing. It has been part of a pressure containment system. The ammunition therefore requires special handling. This is another reminder that the NRS-2 was not a gimmick assembled from spare parts. It was the final visible piece of a much larger Soviet research effort into silent ammunition and specialized firearms. The knife was simply the most unusual place to put that technology. The Soviet special weapons ecosystem had already produced other extraordinary designs around the same principle. The MSP and S4M pistols had used earlier captive piston ammunition. The PSS later became the better-known platform for SP4. The NRS-2 adapted that same ammunition family into a weapon that looked nothing like a pistol. This continuity is important. It shows that the NRS-2 was not an isolated experiment. It was part of a technological progression. The Soviets had spent years learning what silent ammunition could and could not do. They learned that reducing sound and flash was possible without relying on a conventional suppressor. They learned that special ammunition could make a compact weapon practical. And once the SP4 system existed, it made sense to bring other special weapons into the same ammunition family. Standardization has enormous value in military logistics. Even specialized units benefit when related weapons can share a cartridge. The NRS-2 therefore became a specialized companion to a broader silent weapon system. Yet its single-shot design remained fundamentally different from the PSS. The PSS was a pistol. It was intended to provide repeated shots. The NRS-2 was still a knife. Its firearm function was secondary. That comparison reveals the weapon's intended place in the hierarchy. If a mission required a dedicated silent pistol, the PSS made more sense. If the user needed a knife that could also provide one discrete shot, the NRS-2 made sense. It was not competing for the same job. It occupied the narrow space between tools and weapons. That is also why the weapon's firing posture looks so strange in photographs. The handle points toward the target. The blade extends behind the hand. The entire object has to be treated differently from an ordinary firearm. The designers had to work within the geometry of a knife. They could not simply rotate the barrel into a normal pistol configuration without destroying the central purpose of the design. The result is an object that looks almost backwards when fired. That is not poor ergonomics by accident. It is the inevitable consequence of hiding the gun inside the handle. The engineers had chosen concealment over conventional handling. Every strange feature follows from that decision. The short barrel follows from the limited space. The one-shot capacity follows from the need to keep the handle compact. The crude sights follow from the short-range emergency roll. The removable barrel follows from the need to load the cartridge within a tiny housing. The unusual firing posture follows from the placement of the muzzle. The knife-like appearance follows from the requirement that the firearm disappear into an existing field tool. Nothing about the weapon is random. It is a chain of compromises, and every compromise points back to the original problem. But then comes the uncomfortable question. What happens when the compromise becomes too extreme? A weapon that can do everything may end up doing nothing exceptionally well. The NRS-2 is a perfect example. As a knife, it was more complicated than an ordinary knife. As a firearm, it was far less capable than a conventional pistol. As a silent weapon, it offered only one shot. As survival equipment, it carried useful features, but also added mechanical complexity. The NRS-2 therefore occupied a narrow operational niche. That does not make it a failure. It means the weapon had to be evaluated against the mission for which it was created. In a firefight, it was a terrible substitute for a pistol. In a survival situation where the user already needed a knife and desperately wanted one discreet shot, it could be extremely valuable. Military equipment often works this way. The best weapon is not always the one with the most firepower. Sometimes it is the one that is available when the others are not. The NRS-2 was designed for the contingency after the contingency. The rifle might be lost. The pistol might be unavailable. The soldier might be isolated. The mission might demand discretion. At that point, the object hanging from the belt could become unexpectedly important. This is where the NRS-2's mythology and its reality separate. Popular descriptions often make it sound like a weapon designed for assassins, a secret killer's knife that could fire silently from a hidden barrel. The historical reality is more restrained. It was a special-purpose Soviet reconnaissance knife associated with Spetsnaz and other specialized users. It was designed to provide a single silent or low-signature shot while retaining the utility of a field knife. That is already remarkable. It does not need invented assassinations or fictional intelligence operations to become fascinating. The real engineering is strange enough, and the real Soviet military environment was dangerous enough. The Cold War was not a world in which every unusual weapon saw dramatic combat. Much of the competition occurred in research institutes, proving grounds, design bureaus, factories, training areas, and classified procurement programs. Engineers built something because a requirement existed. Soldiers tested it. Officers judged whether the compromise was worth the cost. Some weapons spread widely. Others remained specialized. The NRS-2 survived because it filled a niche. That survival is itself evidence that someone, somewhere, believed the capability was useful enough to keep. The knife entered Soviet service in 1986, just as the Cold War was approaching its final years. That timing creates another historical irony. The weapon was born from decades of Soviet special weapons development, but it arrived near the end of the Soviet era. Within a few years, the geopolitical world that had produced it would begin to collapse. The Berlin Wall had already fallen by 1989. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself disappeared, yet the NRS-2 did not disappear with it. The design continued into the post-Soviet period. Russian special units and law enforcement organizations retained examples of specialized equipment from the Soviet arsenal, and the NRS-2 became one of those unusual survivors. That longevity tells us something important. Its purpose was not dependent entirely on the Soviet flag. The tactical problem remained. A soldier or operator might still need a field knife. He might still value a discreet backup firearm. He might still operate where carrying additional equipment was undesirable. The geopolitical system changed, the niche remained, and the NRS-2 was small enough, specialized enough, and established enough to continue existing. That is perhaps the most revealing ending for a weapon that looks so futuristic and strange. It did not conquer the battlefield. It did not become a legendary standard weapon. It did not replace the pistol. It did not revolutionize infantry combat. It simply remained available for the rare situation it had been designed to address. But there was another consequence of the weapon's existence. It demonstrated a recurring principle in Soviet weapons engineering. When conventional solutions create a tactical problem, redesign the system from the ground up. Instead of asking how to make a pistol quieter, engineers developed ammunition that trapped its own gases. Instead of carrying a separate silent pistol and knife, the NRS-2 combined two functions into one object. Instead of maximizing ammunition capacity, the designers accepted one shot because the weapon's primary purpose was something else. This was not always the most efficient approach. It was often strange. Sometimes it produced weapons that looked like science fiction, but it reflected a willingness to solve military problems in unconventional ways. The NRS-2 is a tiny example of that larger mentality. Its importance is not measured by the number of battles it decided. There is no famous war named after it. There is no iconic photograph of an entire army carrying it. It did not become the Soviet equivalent of the AK-47. Its historical value comes from what it reveals about the people who designed it and the missions they imagined. They imagined soldiers cut off from support. They imagined reconnaissance teams operating far from friendly lines. They imagined situations in which a normal firearm might be unavailable or undesirable. They imagined that one discreet shot could be worth more than another kilogram of equipment. And then they built a machine around that assumption. The NRS-2 also exposes the limits of military engineering. The designers could not escape physics. The barrel was short. The ammunition was specialized. The weapon had only one shot. The sights were basic. The firing position was unusual. The system was never going to become a general-purpose handgun. The engineers did not defeat those limitations. They accepted them. The NRS-2 is therefore not a story about technology overcoming every obstacle. It is a story about technology choosing which obstacles to accept. That is one of the most important lessons in weapons design. Every weapon is a negotiation between competing demands: firepower versus weight, range versus compactness, reliability versus complexity, concealment versus ergonomics, capacity versus size. The NRS-2 simply makes those negotiations visible. You can see them in the handle. You can see them in the short barrel. You can see them in the single cartridge. You can see them in the blade and sheath. The entire weapon is a physical argument about priorities. And perhaps the most surprising part of the argument is that the gun is not really the star. The knife is. The firearm exists because the knife already exists. That reversal is what makes the NRS-2 so memorable. Most combination weapons begin with a firearm and add another tool. The NRS-2 begins with a tool and hides a firearm inside it. The difference sounds small. It is not. It changes the entire philosophy of the design. The gun is no longer the primary object. It is the secret function. That means the weapon can be carried, handled, and stored as a knife, while preserving the possibility of a firearm when needed. It is a form of redundancy, and military planners love redundancy because warfare destroys plans. Radios fail, vehicles break, ammunition runs out. Units become separated, equipment gets lost. A soldier who has one tool that can perform several jobs has at least one more option when the plan collapses. The NRS-2 was designed for that collapse. It was not the weapon of the perfect mission. It was the weapon of the imperfect mission. That is why the title's most important word is not gun. It is hid. The Soviet knife did not merely carry a firearm. It concealed one. The difference is the entire purpose. A visible pistol tells everyone what it is. The NRS-2 tells them almost nothing until the user chooses to reveal its second function. That kind of concealment had obvious value for specialized military operations, but it also created a safety problem. A knife handle that contains a firearm is an inherently unusual object. The user must understand which end is dangerous and why. The mechanism must be secured. The firing system must be handled with discipline. The weapon's very novelty increases the possibility of misuse if the operator does not know exactly what he is holding. This is another reason the NRS-2 was never going to become a universal infantry weapon. Specialized equipment belongs with specialized training. A conventional pistol is already a complicated machine under stress. A pistol hidden inside a knife adds another layer of mental and mechanical complexity. The Soviet system accepted that because the intended users were trained for specialized equipment. But the trade-off remained. A weapon can be clever and still be difficult. It can be technically brilliant and tactically narrow. The NRS-2 was both. There is also a deeper irony in its supposedly silent role. Silence was never absolute. The captive piston cartridge dramatically reduced the muzzle signature, but the weapon still made mechanical noise. The projectile still traveled through the air. The impact still produced sound. The operator still had to deal with the physical evidence of a fired cartridge. In real environments, distance, terrain, echoes, and target reaction all mattered. The correct description is therefore not silent magic. It is low-signature special-purpose firepower. That is less sensational than the legend, but much more interesting historically, because it shows exactly what the engineers were trying to accomplish. They were not chasing invisibility. They were reducing the most recognizable signature of a gunshot. That could be enough to change the tactical equation in a very specific situation. And that was the Soviet approach throughout much of its special weapons development. Do not ask for a weapon that can do everything. Ask for a weapon that can do one difficult thing exceptionally well enough to matter. The NRS-2 did not need to dominate a battlefield. It needed to work once. The Cold War eventually ended, but the engineering philosophy remained visible in the weapons that followed. Russian special-purpose arms continued to emphasize compactness, specialized ammunition, suppressed or low-signature fire, and equipment designed around particular missions. The NRS-2 belonged to that lineage. It was not the beginning. It was not the end. It was one unusual branch of a much larger tree. And yet, when people encounter the weapon for the first time, the reaction is almost always the same. They look at the blade. Then they notice the handle. Then they realize the handle contains a barrel. For a moment, the weapon seems impossible. A knife that fires a bullet sounds like something invented by a spy movie prop designer. But it was real. It entered Soviet service. It was engineered around real ammunition. It was built for real special-purpose users, and its existence was driven by a real tactical problem. That is what makes it more compelling than fiction. Fiction has to invent a reason for the gun knife to exist. The Soviet Union already had one. The world of Cold War reconnaissance created it. A soldier operating behind enemy lines could need a knife every day and a firearm only once. The NRS-2 gave him both. The price was that neither function could be optimized independently. The knife carried the burden of the gun. The gun carried the limitations of the knife. But perhaps that was exactly the point. When equipment has to be carried into hostile territory, perfection is often less valuable than versatility. One object that is good enough at several tasks can be more useful than several specialized objects that are impossible to carry. The NRS-2 was a physical expression of that idea. The blade could cut. The sheath could help defeat wire, the handle could deliver one low-signature shot, and if none of those functions were needed, the weapon simply remained a knife. That last detail matters. A piece of equipment that can be carried without revealing its full capability gives the operator options. In the dangerous world of reconnaissance, options are survival. But the NRS-2 also teaches a lesson about how history remembers weapons. We tend to remember the machines that changed wars, the tank that broke a front, the aircraft that destroyed a fleet, the rifle carried by millions, the missile that altered strategic doctrine. Yet military history is also filled with objects designed for moments so rare that their very success is difficult to measure. A weapon like the NRS-2 might be used only occasionally. Its tactical effect might never appear in a major report. Its most important contribution might be the confidence of the person carrying it, the knowledge that if the worst possible situation arrived, there was still one more option hidden in the equipment already on his belt. That is impossible to quantify. But soldiers have always valued redundancy for precisely that reason. The equipment carried on a mission is a collection of answers to questions that may never be asked. What if the radio dies? What if the bridge is blocked? What if the vehicle breaks down? What if the enemy is closer than expected? What if the main weapon is lost? The NRS-2 answered one of those questions with an object that looked like a knife. That answer was strange because the question was strange. And the stranger the battlefield problem, the stranger the solution can become. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the NRS-2 had already entered service and established its place as a specialized weapon. The country that created it disappeared, but the weapon did not immediately become obsolete. Russia inherited much of the Soviet special-purpose arsenal, and the NRS-2 continued to exist alongside other specialized systems. Its persistence is not evidence that it was a universally successful weapon. Quite the opposite. It suggests that the narrow problem it solved had not completely vanished. Special operations still required compact equipment. Reconnaissance still required tools. Covert action still valued reduced signatures. And soldiers still sometimes found themselves isolated from the equipment they would normally depend upon. The political map changed. The tactical realities did not. That is why the NRS-2 survived longer than the country that built it. There is something almost poetic about that. A weapon designed for a world of secret borders, frozen standoffs, intelligence operations, and possible global war outlived the empire that imagined those missions. The knife became a relic and a working tool at the same time. Its Soviet origins became part of its mythology, while its practical design continued to make sense to later users. And somewhere inside that handle remained the same basic idea: one shot, when one shot might be enough. But there is one final question. Why did the Soviets go to all this trouble instead of simply giving the soldier another pistol? Because sometimes the answer is not more firepower. Sometimes the answer is fewer things to carry. Sometimes the weapon you need is not the weapon you expect to use. Sometimes the value of a firearm is not measured by how many rounds it can fire, but by whether it can remain hidden until the precise moment it is needed. That was the logic behind the NRS-2. The Soviet engineers did not create a miracle weapon. They created a compromise so specialized that it almost looks absurd until you understand the mission. Then the absurdity disappears. The knife becomes a field tool. The handle becomes a firearm. The special cartridge becomes a method of reducing the signature of a shot. The single round becomes an emergency reserve. The strange firing posture becomes the unavoidable consequence of concealment. Every odd feature suddenly has a reason, and that is the real story of the NRS-2. Not a secret weapon that could replace the guns of an army, not a Hollywood assassin's toy, not a mythical superweapon that terrified the West. It was something much more precise, a Cold War answer to a very narrow problem, engineered by people who understood that the most dangerous situations are often the ones in which the normal plan has already failed. The knife carried a gun because the soldier might need a gun after the gun was gone. The gun was limited because the knife had to remain a knife. The ammunition was unusual because the mission demanded discretion. The weapon was obscure because its purpose was never to become common. And perhaps that is why it remains so fascinating decades later. The NRS-2 represents a side of military history that is easy to miss when we focus only on famous battles and famous weapons. Wars are not won only by machines that dominate open ground. They are also shaped by tiny decisions about what one person might need in the worst possible minute. A hidden barrel inside a knife may look insignificant beside a tank, a fighter aircraft, or a ballistic missile. But it reveals something fundamental about warfare. The battlefield does not always reward the biggest weapon. Sometimes it rewards the weapon that is still there when everything else has disappeared. And when the Soviet engineers placed a gun inside the handle of a knife, they were not trying to create a legend. They were trying to create one last option. Decades later, that is what remains most remarkable about the NRS-2. It was a weapon designed for the moment when the mission stopped going according to plan. The blade was the tool, the sheath was the equipment, the hidden barrel was the contingency, and the single cartridge was the final answer to a question no soldier wanted to face. What do you do when you are alone? The enemy is close, your normal weapon is no longer available, and you still have one chance left. The Soviet answer was simple enough to fit inside a knife. One shot, no second chance. And perhaps that is the most honest legacy of the NRS-2. Not that it changed warfare, but that it captured warfare's oldest truth in metal, steel, and powder. When everything goes wrong, survival can depend on having one more option than the enemy expects.